Okay, thanks, Miguel. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I was going to attempt to repeat John Stern's welcome in French, but he did it better than I could, so I'm going to stick with English. Okay, so Miguel's touched on a number of themes there which will help me hopefully go through my presentation a little bit quicker. I was asked to talk about some lessons from empirical studies on incentive regulation, particularly in railways. Very specifically, I'm going to focus on top-down econometric international benchmarking. By top-down, I mean we get data on costs and outputs for different units and compare them. I'll say a bit more about what I mean about econometric methods in a moment. The context for all of this is the British regulatory system, where the economic regulator has used international benchmarking, econometric benchmarking, very extensively. In 2008, the review of Network Rail's finances was more or less entirely determined based on an international econometric study. International econometric benchmarking continues to be used, but to a lesser extent now. And I've been working with ORR, also with a colleague of mine, Phil Wheat, at the University of Leeds, since about 2005. Progressively, though, ORR are taking on more and more of the benchmarking, and I'm playing more of a technical support and advice role. So I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done then in the last few years. A couple of data sets there, which I'm going to present results on both. And then, having presented some of the results, I want to have a look at some of the challenges, the lessons and the issues. And I'll just go back to something that Martin Cave said this morning, that there's perhaps been a move from fairly high-level techniques through to increased complexity, and then a step back to say, well, let's go back to basics. And I think benchmarking often gets mentioned in that context. Is it too complicated? Is it reliable enough? Should we step back and do light touch regulation and so on? And my view is it's hugely important to have those kind of discussions, but you're always going to need benchmarking, to my mind, to underpin all of these approaches. For all its weaknesses, I think we'll always need it, and therefore we need to be looking to do the best we possibly can. Very briefly, I'm not going to, just so I can stay on time, there are lots of different methods you could use. As I said, I'm going to focus on international benchmarking and econometric studies. It's important to note that perhaps one method that would be nice to use is yardstick competition. You can use that obviously when you've got 20 water companies or 15 electricity companies. Railways are very different. Typically you've got one rail infrastructure manager in each country. And so international benchmarking takes on a greater role, I think, in rail particularly, and needs to take on that role. Just to say where we started then, this work with ORR, going back to 2005 when I started having discussions with ORR, what was the position that they faced? Well, the position was essentially this, that at that time, rail infrastructure costs in Britain had gone up enormously. So from about £3.5 billion here to around over £7 billion. So costs had gone up hugely. And indeed, cost per train kilometre had gone up hugely. So there was a real need to address this. And in 2003, the regulator did a study, which I guess was using this data at the very peak, and set Network Rail some quite tough targets. But even after having done that, costs were still projected to stay quite high for a number of years. And all of the benchmarking that had been done around that time had been basically been based on what I call here bottom-up studies, i.e. studies where you go into the company and try and work out what's going wrong, look at the management practices, and it also used some internal benchmarking, so comparing different parts of Network Rail against others. But there was a real lack of what I would call top-down benchmarking based on external data. So costs had more or less doubled, but there was no real objective way of saying, is Network Rail now too expensive or not? There was a lot of debate. Was it inefficiency, or was it a real need to deal with problems on the network? What was the real cause? But there was a lack of hard data to establish that. And so, given that, as I said, we don't have any domestic comparators, international benchmarking became top of the agenda. And I hope that maybe answers some comments earlier people were making about, perhaps why did international benchmarking play such a role in Britain's railways? So, as I said, there were two data sets. The first one was from the UIC, and was what I call here a ready-to-go data set. The data existed, it had been collected, partly for the purpose of benchmarking, and at least in theory, it was comparable. We've discussed the problem of not having enough companies. You know, if you want to do statistical analysis, you need more than a few companies. But here we had a panel of 13 companies over 11 years, so the data set was a bit bigger. The cost measure used was a summation of maintenance and renewal, so that was beginning to touch on this TOTEX agenda of trying to add maintenance and capital together. So that was the first data set, and that was the most important one used. But ORR and ITS at Leeds also collected a new data set, smaller number of countries, and also a shorter time period, but we expanded the sample size by using what I've called here sub-company data, that is regions. So we had, say, about 5 or 6 railways, and within each railway there were several regions. So we could compare the performance inside the country and between the countries, and the data set was expanded in that way. So I'll say a bit more about both of those in a moment. For now, what I'd like to do is just step back a bit and ask, you know, what are we trying to do with statistical methods? Miguel has talked about some of the basic principles and some of the different methods that can be applied. So hopefully this is now okay to talk about it conceptually. So the idea may be that we have some kind of frontier, efficiency frontier or best practice. I don't think you can see that's supposed to say cost over there. And this is the output in a simple two-dimensional space for now. So here is the frontier. So this would be the minimum cost, the minimum possible best practice cost of producing a given level of output. And quite obviously, and relating to Miguel's talk as well, this firm here, firm A, is above the cost frontier, so is in some sense, therefore, inefficient. It's costing too much. Okay, so now, so what do we gain from the statistical method? Well, the first thing that we might gain is some information about the shape of the cost function. Okay, so perhaps the cost function isn't, in this case, a straight line. Perhaps there's some kind of curve that looks a bit like this, which implies some sort of economies of scale. So the first advantage of a statistical method is that it allows flexibility to let the data tell you what is the shape of this cost function, what does it look like. And obviously, you know, if you change the shape of the cost function, suddenly firm A now becomes efficient, so it's hugely important, and particularly in network industries where we do have these economies. You might note that we've got on the axis here a single output, maybe train kilometres. You know, what if we change that to track kilometres? And just thinking about what's implied by this straight line, when you're using unit cost measures, such as cost per train kilometre or cost per track kilometre, effectively you're assuming this kind of straight line. So the statistical method takes you beyond simple unit cost measures, firstly because it allows you to think about the shape of the frontier, but secondly, it allows you to consider train kilometres and track kilometres and a whole range of other methods simultaneously in the model. So what we're trying to do, and I know we're only showing one output down here, we're trying to draw a relationship between costs and output defined in a broad sense, lots and lots of different cost drivers, and having taken account of all of those cost drivers, we can then get a single overall measure of efficiency. So that's what we're trying to do with this method, and that's why the statistical method, I believe, takes us beyond simple unit cost measures. And I think it also gives you some visibility that you can use to sense check your results against it with engineering best practice or previous studies. So, you get some kind of shape for this cost frontier. Does that make sense? And I'm not going to talk through this slide in any detail because it obviously looks fairly horrible. It's got lots of coefficients on it. All I just want to point out is that you get these kind of what we call parameter estimates that are telling you something about the shape of the frontier and what the technology looks like. And if we just, these are the variables, so route kilometres, passenger train density, freight train density. Just to speed up, I'll just say these coefficients imply something like constant returns to scale in this data set. but increasing returns to density. So as you run more traffic down a fixed network, then the unit cost falls. That's what we expect. And so the statistical method gives you some visibility of what your model is telling you about the technology that you can check against engineering best practice. And you don't get that visibility with, for example, data envelopment analysis. And so I think that's one of the other advantages of the statistical method. So just returning then to the actual results from this study. So talking about now these 13 national rail infrastructure managers in Europe over an 11-year period. Network Rail was one of the companies. We were only allowed to reveal the results for Network Rail and not for other companies because it was a condition of the confidentiality. This gives you the output from the main model. So you can first of all see that, so this is the efficiency score for Network Rail over this 11-year period. A score of 1 implies the company is efficient, less than 1 means it's inefficient. You see a big deterioration in efficiency here, which is as the cost started to go up very rapidly after the Hatfield accident, then efficiency got worse and then started to improve a little bit. But the end position was a gap of 40%. And the ORR used this model essentially to set efficiency targets for Network Rail. They didn't set a target of 40%. They aimed away from the frontier a little bit. And then they made a series of adjustments, including recognizing that Network Rail can't possibly achieve a 40% efficiency target over 5 years, so they set a target over 10 years. And so the eventual target that was set was around 20% for a 5-year period, but it was derived straight from this econometric model, but with some, I guess, regulatory judgment attached. So I think the point is clear that one probably shouldn't just mechanically apply the results straight from an econometric model. You want to apply some sensible judgment, which is in line with what Miguel was saying. Just before then I turn to the issues and challenges, I want to just report on another approach, which was, again, international benchmarking. But I think this one's got quite a lot of potential for the future and also not just in rail. The idea behind this model is, I've called it here a dual-level inefficiency model, is that it could be advantageous to get data at 2 different levels. You could have inefficiency sort of can be thought of as residing at 2 different levels in a company. So maybe you have several infrastructure managers across Europe, but within each one you have a set of regions or some other sub-company structure. And so within each country there could be variation in performance between the regions, but then there's also some kind of systematic difference, say, between Britain and France and other countries. And we published this paper in the Journal of Productivity Analysis for the actual approach, but then we applied it using a data set that was collected with ORR. So what you're doing with this approach essentially is collecting data for infrastructure managers, but supplementing it by regional data. And that allows you to compare between countries and within countries. And just to give an illustrative output, this is not actual results, but just to illustrate what you could kind of get from this, you can break down a measure of inefficiency into 2 components, if you like. You could think of the external, sorry, I'll start with the internal. Think of the internal efficiency score. This is, again, just an illustrative number, but it's a score of 0.88, say, on average. What that says is that there's perhaps 1 or 2 regions within a particular country that are the best within that country. And if all of the other regions could just emulate that best practice, then the company could reduce its costs by 12%. So that's one strategy a regulator might have, or a company might have to get it for getting costs down. But then, in addition, perhaps this particular company, Company 1, is also systematically or persistently inefficient relative to some other country, and if the whole company then could emulate best practice internationally, then costs could come down here by another 8%. So, as I say, these are not actual results, but just to illustrate that, I think this is potentially quite a powerful regulatory tool. First of all, because you can get more data points by having the regions. Secondly, you can then compare different regions against each other if you think they're quite comparable between countries, even if a whole network isn't that comparable. And thirdly, it gives you this breakdown between internal and external efficiency. Okay, so there are lots of challenges, and I'll just try and make some observations on these challenges and where things might be heading. Data quality and number of data points is always an issue. There's an issue about the cyclical and lumpy nature of capital costs, which is always a problem. Comparing countries that are very different and have different quality, I think, is very important. And I think there's a question about understanding uncertainty in efficiency modelling. And I'll try and say something about all of those, unless I get told I'm running out of time. Data issues, I'll say very quickly. Regulators typically have a small number of regulated companies. Now, that's a big problem if you're doing statistical analysis. Okay, we've already seen, though, you can expand the data set quite quickly if you can get panel data, so more observations on the same firm over time. Or if you've got this regional data, you can actually have multiple regions in the same country over multiple time periods, and suddenly the data set starts to look bigger and is more interesting or more easy to deal with econometrically. Obviously, you start to get issues in the data of quality and consistency, both between countries and over time. And certainly, I mentioned the UIC, or the LICB, Lasting Infrastructure Cost benchmarking data that was used by ORR in 2008. Network Rail subsequently argued that this data set was not very comparable, and ORR, I think, accepted that in part, and that's the reason why I think the econometric international benchmarking is now, although it's still used by ORR, it's taken a lower priority. But I'm still not completely sure how clear the evidence yet is on the quality of that data set. But one thing that affected the ORR's ability to do international benchmarking in 2008 was the fact that it had this ready-to-go data set. If you actually want to create your own, like we also did with the regional data set, it's very time-consuming, very difficult, and requires lots of commitment and buy-in from lots of different organisations who may have varying incentives to supply data. And I'll return to that at the very end. Capital costs are a problem. This chart illustrates what was happening to the volume of rail being replaced by Network Rail over the period of the efficiency study that we were doing. And you can see it went up very sharply and then was moving around quite a lot. So quite clearly, if you start renewing more track, then you're going to incur more cost. And so what you're trying to do is relate the cost to the final output, which might be train kilometres or even some other final outcome measure like passenger kilometres or something else. But actually, there's a relationship between cost and this intermediate output. How much renewal are you doing? And a regulator can't just accept that costs have gone up because renewals have gone up, because the renewals might be inefficient. That might be the wrong level of renewal to be doing. But at the same time, you can't really ignore the fact that this is a key reason behind the rising costs. And so the general problem is how do you actually incorporate capital costs into efficiency benchmarking? And the way we did it in this particular study, as I said, we added maintenance to the annual CapEx spend, but there was an adjustment made to recognise, there was an assessment made of what is the steady state of renewals in a country, and it was deemed to be around 2.5% for Network Rail, and wherever the renewal volume was above 2.5% of the track of the whole network, then the costs were adjusted down accordingly. So there was an attempt to deal with this directly by adjusting Network Rail's costs before estimation. Other approaches that other regulators take is to add the maintenance costs to some average of the last 5 years of capital. So that's kind of smoothing out some of the lumpiness, but then you start to lose data points. Depreciation measures, I think, are just too problematic to use, and as a cost measure, it's not really controllable by the company. So I think Capital is a difficult issue. Certainly the idea of adding it to maintenance and creating TOTEX-type measures is now becoming quite prevalent amongst regulators. But I think, importantly, what we need to do actually is get quality directly into the cost function, because obviously if a company gets low cost by not doing much renewal, one would hope to see that feeding through into quality measures. And I think that is one of the big gaps in economic regulation. So I'm just going to turn quickly to quality. We could think of our cost function as, in railways, cost is some function of the size of the network, perhaps the density of traffic. There'll then be a whole, I've called this D, this is differences between countries, fundamental differences about the capability, the topography of the country. And it's interesting, actually, that obviously one solution to trying to model differences between countries is to try to get as many of these variables as possible. But often the problem is you can't get the data. It turns out that there are methods, actually statistical methods, that allow you to deal with fundamental differences between countries without actually having the data, which is quite interesting, but I won't talk in more depth on that one. But I would say, I think one of the big gaps, and Miguel referred to it as well, is the lack of quality measures in productivity studies, efficiency studies, benchmarking, not just in regulated industries, but in the academic literature more widely. A whole host of obvious measures that, if your costs come down and you don't take account of these measures in your cost function, then that will make you look efficient. But if you could get those measures into the cost function, then that would massively improve the quality of the efficiency estimates that you get. So I think that's a major area where further work could be done, both on trying to get comparable data, but then looking at some of the issues about how exactly do you model that. I mean, one issue that we came across, for example, in water, was that sometimes you get the wrong relationship. So you might put in a variable like, say, the amount of flooding in the water industry, and what you find is that companies with high flooding, which is bad, have got the high cost, the highest cost, but which is sort of the wrong way round. Ideally, what you're kind of looking for is a relationship that says that if you're high cost, you've got high quality, and that's partly just because of the lags in the system. The reason is that if you're dealing with flooding, then you're having to increase costs to deal with it. So there are some modelling challenges, but I think that's a really, really important area. But both getting more data, both on the differences and particularly the quality, but then thinking exactly how to model it and getting that much more into the regulatory system. I'm not going to talk about these two slides now, other than to say I think there needs to be more work done on understanding the uncertainty within the results of efficiency models. Often we have, as in this example from ORR, different models with different efficiency gaps between about 13 and 23%, and then maybe regulators take some kind of average, which seems sort of pragmatic and sensible, but what does that average actually mean? What uncertainty you're actually dealing with? Okay. So concluding remarks then. Hopefully I should just about finish on time now. I think international benchmarking, I think, is absolutely key for rail infrastructure, more so than other industries because of the lack of domestic comparators, but I think it's important even for other industries where you can get lulled into a false sense of security by the performance just of the companies in your country. I've talked about these challenges. You need more data, you need better data over time, and really importantly, I think getting quality into the model, ideally into the model. Maybe regulators can apply judgement and off-model analysis, but it would be good to get it into the model. It's a huge commitment, and what we've found, with this UIC data, for example, this is actually data that's owned by the members, and some members, once they saw this was being used for benchmarking, were reluctant to continue. ORR found it difficult to get direct understanding of the data. They had to rely on what Network Rail was telling them about whether the data was good or not, which is not ideal from a regulatory perspective. The data set that we collected ourselves was, you can sometimes have a good one-shot game, but then can you get companies to keep on being involved year after year after year? And I think the ideal would be for economic regulators across Europe or ministries to coordinate and cooperate on I suppose, a pan-European yardstick competition approach. And that's ambitious and obviously highly political and would require lots of legislation. Lots of challenges then, but I think getting quality into the data. And maybe one final remark then. I've talked about quality. I mean, looking ahead, perhaps we need to think about quality in a wider sense. I mean, what about what we might call resilience? So a network could be very expensive, but perhaps it's very resilient to climate change. And we see pictures like this, particularly from the UK and elsewhere. We need to deal with all the challenges I've mentioned earlier, but looking ahead, perhaps building in resilience into economic regulation could become even more important. Okay, thank you.